Hello friends, welcome back to Liz's Reading Corner, or welcome if you're new here. I'm Liz and I like books, and this is part 2 of reading Stephen King's Scariest novels according to Goodreads readers. This is actually my second introduction. I had a whole different introduction that was filmed and that had to just kind of go in the bin because I didn't actually end up vlogging anything while I was reading these books. So this is just going to be a sit down talk through basically of the books and what I thought of them and their spooky ratings, much like the first book, much like the first video. I have books on the brain. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. So this is probably going to be a lot quicker video than the part 1, but we'll see how we go. It depends how much I ramble, really. I tend to have a habit of rambling apparently when it comes to books. So anyway, the books. Number 5 was Misery. This is one of my favorite books. It's also one of my favorite movies. I think that the adaptation that they did was very well done and very, very close to the story. If I'm honest, it's probably one of the closest adaptations I've ever seen when it comes to book to movie adaptations. But for those of you who don't know, for those of you who haven't watched the movie or haven't read the book, this is a book about an author named Paul Sheldon. He is the best-selling author of the Misery Chastain series. He has just killed off Misery Chastain in his previous novel because he actually hates her, or he thinks he hates her, and he is in the process of writing a new series or a new book about a completely different subject. On his way home from wherever he was, I can't remember where he went to, but he's driving home. He decides to take one of the back roads instead of staying on the highway, and he ends up having a car crash in a snowstorm. He is found by Annie Wilkes, who is his longtime #1 fan. She absolutely adores the Misery Chastain series, and she finds Paul, realizes who he is, and takes him to her home, which is in a remote part of the mountains in, I can't remember what town. She just lives on a very remote property. So the first 50 or so pages is probably a little bit less actually, but it is Paul recovering from the car accident and just kind of figuring out what is going on and where he is and whose house he is at. We find out that Annie is actually a nurse, not currently working as a nurse, but she has a very well-stocked medicine cabinet, and she is feeding Paul some very good opioids, basically. Annie finds out that Paul has killed off her favorite character, which she is really upset by, and she also finds the manuscript for his new book, decides that it is absolutely disgusting and that he must burn the manuscript for that book and write Misery back to life. Paul very quickly comes to realize that Annie actually has a severe temper, like a bad temper, and she is, once she sets her mind on a way of punishing him, she absolutely follows through on it, and some of the punishments that he receives are quite gruesome. That's probably the best way I have of putting it. I don't want to ruin too much of the book because it is nice to have like little bits that you don't know about. So Paul ends up starting to write this book, and Annie starts reading it, but throughout the story, Annie has these episodes where she just has to go away for a little bit of time because she knows that her temper is getting the better of her. Eventually, the police come looking, so they realize that Paul is missing, and they find his car, and because Annie's house is very close to where they find Paul's car, the police come and ask her questions. Annie ends up killing this policeman, and obviously others come looking for her, so she hides his body and his car at another property that she owns close by, and other policemen come looking, and eventually Paul is found and rescued, and the end of the story is just how like Paul is dealing with the aftermath. So even though he knows that Annie is dead, she still kind of haunts him, basically. like I said, absolutely adored this book. I don't think I did a very good job. I tried to do a synopsis or a walkthrough of the story without giving too much away, because like I said, I think it is definitely one of those books that everyone should experience. Like, this is another one where if you're going to read a Stephen King book, this is a really good Stephen King book to read, purely because, so there's a couple of reasons actually. Two of my viewers brought up very good points. Stephen King has this habit, and it's something that has turned me off a lot of his books. He has this habit of injecting his political opinion into his stories, and like, that's cool, they're his books, it's his prerogative to do that, but I feel like we are so oversaturated when it comes to politics that it's just not something that I want to read in the books that I am reading. That's just not something that interests me, in the same way that I am not interested in, like, I have triggers and I'm not interested in certain things, like romance. It's along the same lines as that for me. And so I just feel like authors just shouldn't put their political opinions in their books. You want to have a political opinion? Absolutely go nuts. Just don't put it in your books. So that's one thing that turns me off of Stephen King, a lot of Stephen King's books. And the other is his ability to waffle. He has so much waffle in so many of his books that I really, really struggle. It's one of the reasons why I didn't like The Stand. It's one of the reasons why I didn't like Gerald's Game. It's one of the reasons why I didn't like, what was the other one? His most recent one, like the collection of short stories. A lot of them just feel like waffle too. And so Misery doesn't really have much waffle. A lot of what is in the book is core to the story. So it makes for a much better reading experience, and it's really quite fast paced. Spooky wise, I would probably give it, I feel like my spooky is broken because I don't find these spooky, because I've been reading them since I was a child. So I don't find this scary. I can see why people find this one scary. I would probably give it maybe a 2 on the spooky rating, so 2 ghosts. And I rated it 4 stars, but honestly, the book that I found the spookiest of Stephen King's is not even on this list, so that's probably going to tell you a lot about the spooky ratings. Number 4 was Salem's Lot. This one I kind of enjoyed, but again, I feel like a lot of waffle could have been cut out. I don't know, maybe it was just because I was trying to get through them. So I started reading all of these on like Friday last week, and it is now Wednesday. Yes, it's Wednesday. So it's Wednesday, and I finished reading it yesterday. So I busted through 5 books in 5 days, 5 Stephen King books in 5 days, which is a pretty big feat even for me. But anyway, this story follows Ben Mears, who returns to Jerusalem's Lot, which is his hometown. He becomes reacquainted with one of his teachers, and he starts dating one of the residents. My brain is not working today. He starts dating one of the residents of the town named Susan, and the whole point of him returning to town is to write a book about his childhood hometown, basically. In his hometown, there is an old house called the Marsden Lot. And Ben believes that he saw a hanging ghost at this abandoned lot, and that is the basis for his book that he is writing. The house that the abandoned lot and the house, basically, that he had this experience in has been bought by an Austrian merchant and converted into an antique store. The guy who bought the store, his name is Kurt Barlow. He is allegedly on this extended buying trip, so the only person that is seen is his buying partner, whose name is Richard Straker. So we find out that Kurt is actually an ancient vampire, and Richard is his human familiar. Kurt and Richard's appearance in town coincides with the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy. He becomes town's first vampire, and they just start turning all of the townspeople, Kurt starts turning all of the townspeople into vampires. one of the kids that Kurt tries to turn into a vampire tries to turn one of his classmates into a vampire and can't actually. He's like resisted by this child, and I say child, I'm pretty sure it's a teenager, and he's resisted because this kid holds a cross up to a plastic cross up to his face, and so he manages to get away. And so the townspeople that haven't been turned kind of start to realize that there is like this vampire infestation in there. Infestation, I don't know if that's the right word, but vampire infestation, for lack of a better term, in their town, and they start to resist. Somewhere in there, Ben's girlfriend gets turned into a vampire, and I'll let you read what happens to her. I'm sure you can guess what happens to her. It's pretty obvious, given that she's a vampire, what he has to do, I guess, to get away from her. This whole story culminates into like a big fight scene between Ben and Kurt the vampire. And eventually Kurt is just run out of town. There's a couple of like gruesome-ish deaths, and then Ben and one of the other characters goes on this flight across country, as in they flee the town, and end up in Mexico. And they are just basically trying to recover from their ordeal or what they went through. And then in the epilogue, it kind of, I have no idea if Salem's Lot actually has a sequel. I probably should have looked that up, but it seems like it was left open for a sequel in the epilogue, because they actually go back to the town and with the intent of dealing with this vampire infestation that has been left in this town. Like I said, I don't know if it was just because I was trying to get through these books really quickly because I wanted to try and have all of this read for Halloween, and have this video up for Halloween. So I just kind of like tried to speed read through these. I don't know if that's why I didn't enjoy it as much, like if I'd read it just normally, but it did feel like there was a lot of waffle in this book as well. So I only gave it 3 stars. And for spooky, I don't know. I don't think it's very spooky. It's just basically like a vampire story. I think into the Interview with the Vampire series was a lot spookier than this. So I would probably only give it like a 1 ghost rating at the very most. Number 3 is Pet Sematary. This book, much like Cujo, the start of this book is absolutely heartbreaking as a parent. But this book follows the Creeds. So the Creed family, Lewis and Rachel and their 2 children, Ellie and Judd, and their cat, Winston Churchill. They move into this old house that is on a highway. The Creeds become friends with their neighbor across the road from them, Judd Crandall. Judd warns them obviously about the highway and about how there are speeding trucks. Lewis kind of treats him as like the father he never really had, because his father died when he was very young. And one evening when Lewis is talking to Judd tells him about this pet cemetery that is apparently in the woods behind their house. On Thanksgiving, their cat, Winston Churchill, is unfortunately run over by a truck. Lewis decides to go and plant him in this pet cemetery. So there's this magic in a certain part of the cemetery where if you if you bury your pet in this specific part, it will actually come back to life. The problem is it doesn't actually come back the way it was before. The magic kind of corrupts them somehow, and for lack of a better term. So Lewis buries Winston Churchill in this cemetery. He comes back to life, but the thing is, he doesn't actually really eat. He just kind of hunts animals and just rips them apart for fun, and he kind of starts to smell really bad. And so Lewis just begins to wish he'd never done it, basically never buried the cat there. A couple of months later, and this is the part that was really horrible, Gage is hit by one of those trucks and killed. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. Lewis decides to bury him in the cemetery to bring him back to life. And he comes back to life. But much like with Winston Churchill the cat, he is not himself. He is basically like a demon child. Gage finds one of his father, so Lewis, I should have said at the start, Lewis is a doctor. Gage finds one of his father's scalpels, goes over and kills Judd, and also kills Rachel, his own mother. She is buried, and then, or they are buried, and then Lewis goes back and deals with Gage and Winston Churchill, and then he ends up burning down their house, and then he goes back to the cemetery, disinters his wife's body, and takes her up to the pet cemetery in order to reanimate her corpse. And that's the end of the book. Now, I can see again why people find this one creepy. The like creepy child thing seems to be something that a lot of people just can't handle. It's not one of the worst things for me. It's just, it's what it is. There are far creepier things out there than children, or than creepy children. So Pet Sematary doesn't have a lot of what I would consider waffle, but I just don't. I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of just a middling book for me. It's not great, but it's not terrible. It's also not really spooky. I didn't find it spooky. I know I found it spooky when I first read it, so I'm going to take that into consideration. I remember being a little bit freaked out when I first read it, so I'm going to give it 2 ghosts for spooky rating. It's just a real middling book, and so I only gave it 3 stars. So that was, sorry, I should have had this next to me the whole time. That was Pet Sematary. Number 2 is The Shining. This really needs no introduction. This is probably one of Stephen King's most famous books, and one of the most famous adaptations. I'm pretty sure almost everyone has heard of The Shining, but for those of you who don't know or haven't seen the movie or read the book yet, this follows Torrance's, so Jack, who has been fired from his teaching position, Wendy, his wife, Danny, or Doc as they call him. So Danny has like an imaginary friend. Jack gets a position as the winter caretaker at the Overlook Hotel. It gets snowed in and is completely cut off from everywhere over the winter. And so Jack takes Wendy and Danny with him. When they first get there, they meet one of the chefs whose name is Dick, I think it is Halloran. Mr. Halloran finds out that Danny can also do what he calls the Shining. It's basically like a telekinetic ability. And so he warns Danny that there are some horrible things, like truly horrific things that have happened within the hotel, and to stay away from a lot of things, a lot of areas, sorry. And if he sees things, they're not real. And if he needs any help, to just send out a signal through his Shining, and Mr. Halloran will get to him as quickly as possible. Jack is actually a recovering alcoholic and is an aspiring author. Wendy is happy that they're going to be in the Overlook Hotel because there is no alcohol there. It's a place for him to just basically knuckle down and write his story. They get snowed in and the spooky stuff starts to happen. So Jack starts to see the ghosts. Jack starts to get paranoid, and he starts believing that he can see these other people that are there, and he thinks that Wendy is turning Danny against him. This culminates in a big fight between Jack and Wendy, and then Jack goes on a rampage and tries to kill Wendy and Danny, and they eventually escape. In amongst all of this, Danny sees some really, really scary ghosts, one of which is like the twins in the hallway that everyone is afraid of. And so they eventually escape. They get out and leave Jack at the Overlook Hotel to his fate. That's probably the briefest synopsis I could have given you, really. the briefest of all of the books that I've reviewed in this series. Honestly, again, there's not a lot of fluff in this book. It is really well written. It's one of my favorites. There's a reason that a lot of people like it. There's kind of a reason why a lot of people find it scary, because again, it's like ghosts and a haunted hotel and scary children and like supernatural abilities and that sort of thing. In saying that, I would probably only again give this one 2 ghosts, because I again have been reading this for a long time. In the first time I read it, I don't remember really being scared, but again, it does have all the elements of like a spooky book. So 2 ghosts, and I rated it 4 stars. 4 stars. It was 4-star read. All right, and that brings us to number 1. Unsurprisingly, it is It. This is probably his most famous book, definitely his most famous adaptation, especially considering they've just recently done a movie adaptation of it. It follows a group of children who live in Derry, Maine. These children all eventually become friends. They call themselves the Losers Club. Well, let's see if I can remember the names. They are Ben, Bill, Eddie, Richie, Beverly, and Stan. I think that's all of them. And they call themselves, so they call their group of friends the Losers Club. Their town is also the home to an ancient being who came to Earth hundreds of years ago. It's like an alien, and it's not actually a clown like everyone thinks that it is, but we'll get to that. Not my biggest gripe of the entire thing. So it runs on a cycle. Every 27 years it wakes to feed. So it hibernates for 27 years, and then it wakes to feed for a few months in the year, and then it goes back to hibernating. And so these children find out about this ancient being, and they find out its cycle, and they try to stop it when they are children. They think that they have defeated it, but they didn't actually. So they all go their separate ways, but one of them, Mike, stays in town, or stays living in town, and he brings them all back because he's like, the cycle is starting again. We need to actually get rid of it once and for all, because if we don't do it now, then we're going to be too old to do it, and it's just going to keep on doing it until someone else realizes that it actually exists. So they go back down into the sewers like they did when they were children and defeat it. So the start of the book is quite graphic. At the start of the book, Bill, who is part of the Losers Club, his younger brother Georgie goes out to sail a little sailing boat that Bill made for him, that is made of newspaper and covered in like camphor. And because there's a storm and like there's water running in the gutters, and so he sails his boat in these gutters, and it goes down the storm drain. And when he's trying to find the boat in the storm drain, this clown pops up and Georgie is killed. I think that's probably the safest way to put it. Georgie is killed. And so I think that becomes like the basis for Bill wanting to, or like the main reason behind Bill wanting to get rid of it. Throughout the story, it is depicted as a clown, but, and this is why it's the sticking point for me, the main thing that this ancient being becomes, is whatever your biggest fear is. So it is not necessarily a clown. It is actually an alien that can turn into whatever your biggest fear is. And that's what it does in order to intimidate you and scare you, and then to kill you and eat you. It only goes typically after children. So that's my biggest gripe out of the way, because it really frustrates me, because everyone that I speak to that hasn't actually read the book, they just assume that it's the scary clown. And there's a lot of people in the world that are terrified of clowns, partly because of the movie, like the adaptation. And it makes me really sad, because much like with any other adaptation, there's like these little things that are missed within the adaptations, and they're kind of like key parts of the story. And so I feel like that is just like a key part of the story, is that it turns into whatever you're afraid of. It's not necessarily a clown. So not everyone is afraid of clowns in this town. It's just that's what it turns into, or is depicted as most, when it's not. So like when it's trying to intimidate them, that's how it's displayed, but it's not actually a clown. It's not a killer clown, it's a killer alien. But anyway, that rant over and done with. I'm sorry. It frustrates me. So with that over and done with, I loved this. I've read this so many times. I gave it 5 stars, which is unsurprising, and I would probably, because it does get quite spooky, like it didn't spook me out this time because I only read it last year, but before that it had been a few years since I'd read it, and it still was quite spooky. So I would give this a three ghosts. This is quite spooky, but it is also really quite long. So it is difficult to get through, and I understand that not a lot of people like to read really long books. Honestly, it probably would have done really good as a series, like a series of books, but if you can get through all 1,000 odd pages of it, it is definitely worth the read. If you don't want to, honestly, watching the latest adaptation gets pretty close. It's pretty close to it. This ended up being a lot longer than I intended, and it's not going to be this long because I know I'm going to edit it down, but I've been recording for an hour, so that ended up being a lot longer than I intended on talking about a bunch of books. Although, truth be told, I could talk about these books for hours. I could talk about books for hours. Who are we kidding? Anyway, that is the top 10 scariest books that Stephen King has written according to Goodreads readers, and I would really love to know your thoughts. Which one do you think is the scariest? If you're a Stephen King reader, if you're not a Stephen King reader, which book is the scariest that you have ever read in honor of spooky season? If you have any reading challenges that you would like me to do, as always, I would love to hear them, or any suggestions for books, please leave them in the comments down below. I have a few videos that are coming up very soon, so I have some more reading challenges that I've started, and that is it. I appreciate you all for sticking with me, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.